A 73-year-old veteran stands trembling before a judge, clutching a manila folder filled with his dying wife's medical bills. He's been caught running a red light. $85 fine. Case closed. Simple, right? But when this elderly man began to speak, his voice cracking as he explained why he was speeding that rainy night, when he mentioned his wife of 49 years fighting cancer, when he talked about working overtime at 73 just to pay for her treatments, the entire courtroom went silent. Judge Caprio looked at this proud veteran, a man who had served his country, built a business with his bare hands, and was now watching the love of his life slip away. And what happened next shocked everyone in that room. What Judge Caprio said next didn't just change Harold Mitchell's day. It reminded an entire nation what justice with compassion actually looks like. No one, not the court officers, not the camera crew, not Harold himself, saw this coming. The courtroom was unusually quiet that Tuesday morning in Providence, Rhode Island. Outside, November rain drummed against the tall windows of the municipal courthouse, creating a somber backdrop for what would become one of the most powerful moments ever captured on television. Inside courtroom 6A, Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his reading glasses and glanced at the docket before him. Traffic violations, parking tickets, the usual municipal infractions that filled his days. But this morning, something felt different. At 9:47 a.m., the bailiff called out, "Case number 2018, 4472, Harold Mitchell." From the back of the courtroom, a figure slowly rose. Harold Mitchell, 73 years old, moved with the deliberate pace of a man whose body had weathered decades of hard living and harder memories. His weathered hands gripped a worn manila folder containing documents that told the story of his recent troubles. Gray stubble covered his weathered face, and his eyes held that particular weight that comes from seeing too much and losing too much over the course of a long life. Harold wore his only good shirt, a faded blue button-down that had seen better days, pressed carefully that morning with an iron borrowed from his neighbor. His black shoes were polished but cracked, and his gray slacks were clean but threadbare at the knees. As he made his way toward the defendant's podium, every step seemed to carry the weight of his 73 years, including the last two that had brought him to this moment of reckoning. The cameras of Caught in Providence rolled silently, capturing what would soon become a viral moment watched by millions around the world. Producer Tim Almy had filmed hundreds of these municipal court sessions with Judge Caprio, but something about Harold Mitchell's slow, dignified walk to the front of the courtroom made him lean forward instinctively. This felt different. Judge Caprio looked up from the paperwork spread before him. The charge was straightforward enough. Harold had been caught on camera running a red light at the intersection of Westminster and Union Streets on a rainy evening 3 weeks prior. The fine was $85, standard for this type of moving violation. In most courtrooms across America, this would be a 5-minute interaction. State your name, enter your plea, pay the fine, case dismissed. But Frank Caprio had never run a typical courtroom. As Harold reached the podium, he stood straight despite the clear effort it took. His military bearing was still evident, even after all these years. There was something about the way he held his shoulders, the way he looked directly at the judge without defiance, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had served his country and faced far worse than a traffic court appearance. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had made him beloved by viewers worldwide. "I see here you're charged with running a red light. How are you doing today?" The simple question hung in the air. In that moment, Harold Mitchell's composed exterior began to crack ever so slightly. His lips pressed together, and he took a slow breath before speaking. When he finally responded, his voice was steady but quiet. "Your Honor, I'm doing the best I can under the circumstances." Judge Caprio set down his pen and looked directly at Harold. Something in the older man's tone, in the careful way he chose his words, caught the judge's attention. This wasn't the usual traffic court defendant making excuses or trying to get out of a fine. This was something else entirely. "Tell me about these circumstances, Mr. Mitchell," the judge said gently, leaning back in his chair. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Harold opened his manila folder with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from age or emotion, it was impossible to tell. He pulled out a stack of papers, medical bills, insurance forms, discharge papers from the VA hospital. The story these documents would tell was one that millions of American veterans knew all too well. "Your Honor," Harold began, his voice growing stronger, "I was rushing to get to the VA hospital that night. My wife, she's been battling cancer, and—" He paused, collecting himself. "She had taken a turn for the worse. I got the call, and I needed to get there." The rain continued its steady rhythm against the courthouse windows. Judge Caprio had heard thousands of excuses over his decades on the bench. But something about Harold Mitchell's quiet dignity, the way he held those medical papers, the tremor in his voice when he mentioned his wife, this was no excuse. This was a man's life laid bare in a municipal courtroom. No one in that room, not the court officers, not the camera crew, not the handful of observers waiting for their own cases, expected what Judge Caprio would say next. The pause stretched on, filled only by the sound of rain and the quiet hum of the courtroom's ventilation system. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his expression softening in a way that would soon touch hearts around the world. The next words out of his mouth would remind everyone present why compassion and justice were never meant to be strangers to each other. Harold Mitchell's story began 73 years earlier in a small farming community outside of Warwick, Rhode Island. He was one of 6 children born to parents who worked the land with their hands and raised their family with the kind of values that seem increasingly rare in today's world: hard work, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to serving something greater than yourself. At 18, like so many young men of his generation, Harold answered his country's call. The year was 1963, and America was just beginning its involvement in a conflict that would define a generation. Harold enlisted in the Army, not because he was eager for war, but because he believed it was his duty. His father had served in World War II, his grandfather in the First World War, and the Mitchell family understood that freedom wasn't free. Harold spent 2 tours in Vietnam as a medic with the 1st Cavalry Division. While other soldiers carried weapons, Harold carried hope. He pulled wounded men from rice paddies, administered first aid under enemy fire, and wrote letters home for soldiers who would never get the chance to send them themselves. The horrors he witnessed and the lives he tried to save left scars that would never fully heal, but they also instilled in him a profound appreciation for life and an unshakable commitment to taking care of others. When he returned home in 1969, Harold did what millions of veterans have done throughout American history. He put his head down and built a life. He married his high school sweetheart, Dorothy, in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church. Using the GI Bill, he learned a trade automotive repair and opened a small garage on the outskirts of Providence. For 43 years, Harold's Automotive was a fixture in the community, known for honest work, fair prices, and Harold's willingness to help anyone who walked through his doors, regardless of their ability to pay. Harold and Dorothy never had children of their own, but they became surrogate parents to dozens of young people in their neighborhood. Harold taught teenage boys how to change oil and replace brake pads, skills that would serve them well in an economy that didn't always provide steady work. Dorothy volunteered at the local school, helping children with reading and staying after hours to tutor those who struggled. The garage provided a modest but comfortable living for 4 decades. Harold and Dorothy weren't wealthy, but they had everything they needed: a small house with a garden where Dorothy grew tomatoes and roses, a reliable truck, and enough left over to help neighbors when times got tough. Harold's military pension supplemented their income, and they looked forward to a quiet retirement filled with small pleasures. But life, as Harold had learned long ago in the jungles of Southeast Asia, doesn't always follow the plans we make. In 2016, at age 69, Dorothy was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The news hit Harold like enemy artillery, sudden, devastating, and completely beyond his ability to control. The woman who had been his anchor for 47 years, who had waited for him to come home from war, who had stood by him through the nightmares and the difficult readjustment to civilian life, was now fighting a battle that even Harold's medic training couldn't help her win. The medical bills began immediately. Despite Medicare and Harold's VA benefits, the costs were staggering. Experimental treatments, specialist consultations, medications that cost more per month than Harold used to make in a season at the garage. Within 6 months, their modest savings were exhausted. Harold made the agonizing decision to sell the garage, the business he had built with his own hands, his life's work, to pay for Dorothy's care. Even that wasn't enough. Harold took a part-time job at a local auto parts store, standing on his feet for 8 hours a day at an age when most men were playing golf or reading newspapers on their front porches. His knees, damaged by years of crawling under cars and decades-old shrapnel from Vietnam, screamed in protest. His back, compressed by time and hard labor, made every shift an exercise in endurance. But Harold never complained, not once. Dorothy was his world, and he would work until his last breath if it meant giving her one more day, one more treatment, one more chance. Most judges would look at a traffic violation and see a simple matter of law and consequence. Red light, camera evidence, fine imposed, case closed. The human story behind the infraction, the desperation of an elderly veteran racing to be with his dying wife, wouldn't factor into the equation. Justice, in most courtrooms, is supposed to be blind to personal circumstances. But Judge Frank Caprio had never been most judges. As Harold stood before him that rainy November morning, clutching his manila folder of medical bills and insurance forms, the judge saw not just a traffic violator, but a man carrying the weight of the world on his 73-year-old shoulders. Judge Caprio leaned forward in his chair, his expression growing more serious as Harold's story unfolded. The cameras continued to roll, but everyone in the courtroom seemed to forget they were being filmed. This wasn't television anymore. This was real life in all its heartbreaking complexity. The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 10 seconds. Judge Caprio sat back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he processed what Harold Mitchell had just shared. The traffic violation, running a red light while rushing to the VA hospital to be with his cancer-stricken wife, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the weight of human suffering that stood before him. Around the courtroom, people had stopped their quiet conversations and paperwork shuffling. Court officers who had heard hundreds of similar cases found themselves leaning in, drawn by something in Harold's quiet dignity that commanded respect. Even the camera crew, professional observers who had trained themselves to remain invisible during these proceedings, felt the gravity of the moment. Judge Caprio looked down at the citation in front of him. The facts were clear. Harold Mitchell, 73, had been photographed by a traffic camera running a red light at 8:47 p.m. on October 15th. The penalty was standard $85 fine, case closed. In the mathematics of municipal justice, it was a simple equation with a predetermined answer. But Frank Caprio had spent decades learning that real justice was rarely simple, and never just about mathematics. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said finally, his voice softer than it had been moments before, "first, let me thank you for your service to our country." He gestured toward the American flag standing in the corner of the courtroom. "Not everyone who sits in that chair has risked their life for the freedoms we all enjoy." Harold straightened slightly, his military bearing evident even in this moment of vulnerability. "Thank you, Your Honor. It was my privilege to serve." Judge Caprio nodded, then continued. "Now tell me about your wife. How is she doing?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between the formal proceedings of law and the messy reality of human experience. Harold's composure, which had held steady through his explanation of the traffic violation, began to crack. She's not doing well, Your Honor." His voice became quieter, more strained. "The doctors at the VA, they're doing everything they can, but—" He paused, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge what everyone in the room understood. Dorothy Mitchell was dying. "How long have you been married?" Judge Caprio asked. 49 years next month, Your Honor. We were supposed to celebrate our 50th anniversary. Dorothy, she's been planning it since our 40th. She has this whole book of ideas, places she wants to visit, people she wants to invite." Harold's eyes grew distant. "She still talks about it, even though we both know." Judge Caprio removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture that gave Harold a moment to collect himself and gave the judge time to think. In his decades on the bench, he had developed an intuitive understanding of when someone was manipulating the system and when someone was genuinely struggling. Harold Mitchell was clearly the latter. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said, replacing his glasses and looking directly at the elderly veteran, "I want you to know that I understand why you were speeding that night. Any husband worth his salt would have done exactly the same thing." Harold nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement, but still clearly expecting to pay the fine. His shoulders remained tense, waiting for the inevitable sentence. Judge Caprio leaned forward. "I also want you to know that you will not be paying this fine today." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Harold's eyes widened, and he started to speak, but Judge Caprio held up a gentle hand. "But that's not all," the judge continued. "Bailiff, do we have an envelope?" Court officer Tony Lepore, who had worked with Judge Caprio for over a decade and had seen him show compassion countless times, understood immediately. He reached into his desk and produced a white envelope, walking it over to the judge's bench. Judge Caprio opened his wallet and began removing bills. $20, $40, $60, $80. He placed them in the envelope and sealed it, then stood up from his chair, something he rarely did during routine traffic court proceedings. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, walking around the bench to where Harold stood, "I want you to take this money and use it to buy your wife some flowers. Tell her they're from Judge Caprio and all the people who believe that love like yours deserves to be celebrated, not penalized." Harold stared at the envelope in his hands, his composure finally breaking completely. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks as 49 years of marriage, 2 years of medical bills, months of working overtime at age 73, and a lifetime of quiet service to his country and community crystallized into this single moment of unexpected kindness. "Your Honor, I don't know what to say." Judge Caprio placed a gentle hand on Harold's shoulder. "You don't need to say anything. You just need to go home to your wife and tell her that there are still people in this world who understand that some things are more important than traffic laws." The courtroom erupted in applause, something that rarely happened in municipal court proceedings. Court officers, waiting defendants, camera crew members, and observers who had come to watch routine traffic hearings found themselves wiping their eyes and clapping for a moment of humanity that reminded everyone present why compassion and justice were never meant to be enemies. The video of Harold Mitchell's appearance before Judge Frank Caprio was uploaded to YouTube on a quiet Thursday evening in November 2018. By Friday morning, it had been viewed 50,000 times. By the end of that weekend, the number had climbed to over 2 million. Within a month, Harold's story had been watched by more than 20 million people around the world, shared across every social media platform, and featured on national news broadcasts from CNN to Fox News. But numbers, impressive as they were, could never capture the true impact of those 8 minutes in courtroom 6A. In hospitals across the country, nurses showed the video to patients facing their own battles with cancer, offering it as proof that kindness still existed in a world that often felt cold and impersonal. Veterans organizations shared Harold's story as a reminder that service to country creates bonds that transcend politics and generation gaps. Marriage counselors used the video to illustrate what 49 years of commitment looked like when tested by life's cruelest challenges. The envelope of money Judge Caprio gave Harold was used exactly as intended. Harold stopped at a flower shop on his way home from court that day and bought Dorothy a bouquet of yellow roses, her favorite. When he told her the story of what had happened in court, Dorothy wept not just for the judge's kindness, but for the reminder that their love story had touched a stranger's heart. Dorothy Mitchell passed away 3 months later on February 14, 2019, Valentine's Day. Harold held her hand as she took her final breath, and her last words were about the yellow roses that still sat on their kitchen table, a daily reminder that compassion could bloom in the most unexpected places. The story didn't end with Dorothy's passing. Harold, devastated but not broken, began volunteering at the VA hospital where his wife had received treatment. He spent his days talking to other veterans, sharing his story, and offering the kind of comfort that can only come from someone who truly understands loss. He became living proof that even in the depths of grief, we can choose to serve others. Judge Caprio, already beloved by millions for his compassionate approach to justice, found Harold's case becoming the defining moment of his career. Letters poured in from around the world, from judges who were inspired to look beyond the letter of the law, from young lawyers who wanted to practice the kind of justice that healed rather than just punished, from ordinary citizens who had been reminded that our institutions could still reflect our highest values. The judge never sought attention for his act of kindness. In interviews, he consistently deflected praise, insisting that he had simply done what any decent person would do. Harold Mitchell served his country with honor and devotion, Judge Caprio would say. He's been caring for his wife with the same honor and devotion. The least I could do was show him the respect he deserved. This humility, this consistent choice to highlight others' humanity rather than his own generosity, became the hallmark of Judge Caprio's legacy. Over his decades on the bench, he dismissed thousands of tickets for struggling single parents, elderly citizens living on fixed incomes, and working people caught between life's demands and society's rules. He never kept count, never publicized his acts of mercy, never used compassion as a tool for personal advancement. Harold Mitchell's case became a symbol of something larger than one judge's kindness or one veteran's struggle. It represented the possibility that our institutions, courts, governments, hospitals, schools could remember their ultimate purpose, serving human dignity. In a time when many Americans felt disconnected from their own government, when trust in institutions was at historic lows, Judge Caprio's courtroom offered proof that justice and compassion were not just compatible, but essential partners. The ripple effects continued for years. Law schools began incorporating discussions of Judge Caprio's approach into their curricula. Judicial training programs started including sessions on empathy and community connection. Most importantly, individual judges across the country began asking themselves the same question that seemed to guide Frank Caprio's every decision: how can I serve justice while still serving humanity? Harold Mitchell returned to Judge Caprio's courtroom one more time, exactly 1 year after his initial appearance. This time, he came not as a defendant, but as a friend, bringing a framed photo of Dorothy holding the yellow roses the judge's money had purchased. He wanted to show Judge Caprio that his kindness had been the last bright spot in his wife's difficult final months. Judge Caprio kept that photo on his desk for the remainder of his career, a daily reminder of why his work mattered beyond the simple enforcement of municipal regulations. Every time he looked at Dorothy's smile in that photograph, he was reminded that justice without compassion was just bureaucracy. But justice infused with human understanding was nothing less than a form of love. This was just one case among thousands, but it revealed the heart of what made Frank Caprio extraordinary. He understood that every person who stood before his bench was fighting battles that didn't appear in their case files, carrying burdens that wouldn't be mentioned in their citations, and deserving of dignity regardless of their infractions. Judge Caprio reminded us that true justice isn't just about applying laws, it's about remembering that behind every case number is a human being worthy of respect, understanding, and sometimes unexpected grace. That is the legacy he leaves behind, and it's a reminder that in our own daily interactions, we all have the power to choose compassion over indifference, understanding over judgment, and love over law. Thank you for reading this tribute to Judge Frank Caprio and Harold Mitchell. If their story touched you, please share it with others so their message of kindness and human dignity can continue to inspire the world.